The story of the United States and Russia is a story of two giants. After World War II, old empires faded, and two superpowers emerged, the US and the Soviet Union. Their clash of beliefs fueled a rivalry that shaped world events for decades. This competition of ideas, backed by military might, became the central struggle of the post-war era. The rivalry defined the next 45 years. The age of superpower rivalry had arrived. The US-Soviet partnership quickly unraveled after the war. Soviet troops stayed in Eastern Europe, installing communist governments in countries like Poland and Hungary. These became satellite states, controlled by Moscow. For Americans, this was a betrayal of wartime promises of freedom. Hopes for a united, peaceful world faded. In 1946, Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Europe was now divided, the democratic West, backed by the US, and the communist East, ruled by the Soviets. The Iron Curtain was a political and ideological barrier, separating families and cutting off communication. The US responded with containment, stopping the spread of communism. President Truman's doctrine pledged support to nations resisting communist takeovers. America was no longer isolated. It was now deeply involved in global conflicts. Money, weapons, and advisors flowed to countries like Greece and Turkey. This set the pattern for decades of Cold War confrontation. The Cold War was cold because the superpowers never fought directly. Nuclear weapons made direct war unthinkable. Instead, they competed for influence, built up armies, spied and backed opposing sides in other countries' wars. The world was locked in a tense global standoff. Every move was watched, every action calculated. The Iron Curtain symbolized a world split in two. The Cold War had truly begun. Berlin became the ultimate symbol of the Cold War. After World War II, Germany and Berlin were divided among the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. West Berlin, deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, was a democratic island. Tensions soared in 1948 when the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, hoping to force the West out. The US and its allies responded with the Berlin airlift, flying in supplies for nearly a year. The blockade failed, but the city remained a flashpoint. Over the years, thousands fled East Germany through Berlin, seeking freedom. In 1961, the East German government built the Berlin Wall overnight, sealing the border. The wall became the most powerful symbol of division, splitting families, trapping millions, and standing as a monument to oppression. For the West, it was a wall of shame. For the East, a protection barrier. The wall stood for 28 years, a stark reminder of the chasm between two worlds. Its fall in 1989 would signal the Cold War's end. Until then, Berlin was a city divided, its fate watched by the world. The struggle for freedom and control played out in its streets. The wall's shadow loomed over an entire generation. Berlin was the Cold War in microcosm. The Cold War's most dangerous moment came in October 1962. US spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The threat was immediate. Major American cities were in range. President Kennedy faced immense pressure. Strike the sites, invade Cuba, or risk nuclear war. Instead, he chose a naval blockade, demanding the Soviets remove the missiles. For 13 tense days, the world held its breath as Soviet ships approached the blockade. Behind the scenes, Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated intensely. Finally, the Soviets agreed to withdraw the missiles. The US promised not to invade Cuba and secretly removed missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended without war. It was the closest the world ever came to nuclear catastrophe. Both sides learned the terrifying cost of brinkmanship. Communication became crucial to avoid future disaster. The world had stared into the nuclear abyss and stepped back. The lesson: in a nuclear age, caution and dialogue could save humanity. The Cold War rivalry extended into space. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, stunning the world. Americans feared Soviet technological superiority and responded by creating NASA. The Soviets racked up early victories. The first animal in orbit, then Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. The US felt left behind, but President Kennedy set a bold goal: land a man on the moon before the decade's end. The Apollo program captured the nation's imagination. Both superpowers poured resources into the space race. In 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon. His words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," echoed worldwide. The moon landing was a triumph of American ingenuity and a symbolic victory in the space race. The competition drove rapid advances in science and technology. Space became a new frontier for superpower rivalry. The world watched as the US and USSR reached for the stars. The space race was about more than science. It was about national pride and global influence. In the end, it showed what humanity could achieve, even in competition. Leaders shaped the Cold War's course. Kennedy and Khrushchev clashed in Berlin and Cuba, but their willingness to communicate averted disaster. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, they established a hotline to prevent misunderstandings. Decades later, Ronald Reagan took a hard line, calling the USSR an evil empire and ramping up military spending. His strategic defense initiative pressured the Soviets economically and militarily. Mikhail Gorbachev, a reformer, recognized the Soviet system was failing. He introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, seeking to save his country. Reagan and Gorbachev built a working relationship, signing treaties to reduce nuclear arms. Their cooperation marked the beginning of the end for the Cold War. Leadership, vision, and dialogue proved decisive. The actions of a few changed the fate of millions. The Cold War was fought through proxy wars around the globe. The US and Soviet Union backed opposing sides in conflicts from Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan. In Korea, the North invaded the South. The US intervened, and the war ended in stalemate. Vietnam saw the US deeply involved in a costly divisive war, ending in communist victory. The Soviets faced their own quagmire in Afghanistan, battling US-backed mujahideen. These proxy wars caused immense suffering and shaped global politics. Local conflicts became international crises. The superpowers' struggle for influence left lasting scars. The Cold War's battles were often fought far from Washington or Moscow. The consequences were felt worldwide. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was in crisis. Gorbachev's reforms unleashed demands for change across Eastern Europe. In 1989, communist governments began to fall. Solidarity won in Poland. Hungary opened its borders. Protests erupted in East Germany. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell as crowds surged through checkpoints. The world watched as East and West Berliners celebrated together, chipping away at the wall. The fall of the wall signaled the Cold War's end. Within a year, Germany reunified and communist regimes collapsed across Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Pact dissolved, and in 1991, the Soviet Union itself broke apart. Russia and 14 new countries emerged from its ruins. The US stood as the world's sole superpower. After decades of tension, hope for a more peaceful world blossomed. The Cold War's end was sudden, dramatic, and peaceful. The world had changed overnight. The age of superpower confrontation was over. A new era had begun. After the Soviet collapse, hopes rose for a US-Russia partnership. In the 1990s, Russia experimented with democracy and capitalism, aided by the US. But resentment over lost power and NATO's expansion fueled Russian anger. Vladimir Putin's rise marked a return to assertiveness and rivalry. Today, US-Russia relations are tense, clashing over Ukraine, Syria, and accusations of election interference. The old ideological battle is gone, but new conflicts have emerged: cyber warfare, energy politics, and regional disputes. Russia remains a major military power with nuclear weapons. The rivalry is no longer about global domination, but it's still dangerous and unpredictable. The story of US-Russia competition continues, shaped by history and new challenges. The world watches as a new chapter unfolds. The legacy of the Cold War still echoes in today's world.